Not all RVs reveal their weaknesses on the lot. Some wait until the miles add up, the seasons change, and the structure starts answering for every shortcut buried inside it. That is where the gap becomes impossible to ignore. While many rigs begin to loosen, leak, creak, or wear unevenly, some older Japanese-built RVs still feel composed, tight, and carefully held together. That kind of longevity does not come from luck, and it does not come from a brochure. It comes from a manufacturing philosophy built around precision, restraint, and long-term discipline. But what exactly are they doing differently? Where does that advantage really begin? And why have so many others failed to match it? The pattern. Step inside one of these older Japanese-built RVs, and the first thing that stands out is how settled everything feels. Not new, not flashy, settled. The doors still shut with confidence. Cabinet lines stay even. Hardware meets where it should. When you move through the cabin, the structure answers with control instead of noise. Nothing feels like it is hanging on by habit. Look closer, and that impression gets stronger. The surfaces still feel supported. Corners remain clean. Panels do not seem to drift away from each other over time. There is a sense of order in the way the interior has held its shape, as though the whole space was designed to absorb years of motion without slowly unraveling. Even after long use, it feels grounded rather than worn thin. That kind of aging leaves clues. It points to choices made far earlier, before the unit ever reached a buyer, and before time had a chance to expose what mattered. To understand why some of these RVs hold their form so well, we have to rewind back to the past layout and materials, and into the manufacturing system that shaped them, where it really starts. What changed in Japanese manufacturing that made long-term durability possible? The shift can be traced to the adoption of statistical quality control in 1950, influenced by post-war industrial reform and the teachings of quality theorists. Factories began measuring variation instead of reacting to failure. Instead of waiting for defects to appear, they studied processes to prevent them. Responsibility moved closer to the source. Workers were trained to monitor their own output. Small inconsistencies were corrected before they compounded. Over time, this method created a culture where preventing a mistake carried more weight than fixing one. The mindset was simple. If the system is stable, the product will be stable. This approach did not rely on heroic effort or flashy innovation. It depended on discipline repeated daily. When variation was reduced, predictability improved. When predictability improved, durability followed. It was not about perfection. It was about narrowing the margin of error. When defects are reduced at the source, variability narrows across entire production runs. Fewer inconsistencies mean fewer compounded weaknesses. That stability, repeated across thousands of units, quietly builds a foundation for products expected to survive movement, stress, and environmental fluctuation. Yet, philosophy alone does not assemble a moving, living space. To understand the impact, let's talk about what happens when improvement becomes routine. But before we go further, take a second to like the video, subscribe for more no-nonsense analysis, and share your thoughts below. Continuous improvement as habit. In Japanese industry, the concept of Kaizen turned refinement into habit. Instead of dramatic overhauls, teams made small adjustments constantly. A process might change by a fraction of a millimeter or a minor timing shift. Each tweak seemed insignificant on its own. Over decades, those refinements compounded. Workers were encouraged to question inefficiencies. Suggestions were not dismissed as complaints. They were treated as contributions. Authority to improve did not sit exclusively with management. It moved across the floor. That diffusion of responsibility built a feedback loop where incremental gains accumulated steadily. The result was not a sudden leap forward. It was quiet resilience. Processes became smoother. Variability decreased further. When something deviated, it was corrected quickly, not buried. That consistency shaped not just cars, but any product built within that ecosystem. Extend that discipline beyond passenger vehicles, and its implications grow. Apply it to something more intricate, more exposed, more vulnerable to movement and time, and the stakes rise dramatically. Incremental refinement does not generate headlines, yet it changes outcomes profoundly. A process adjusted by small margins year after year accumulates structural advantages. Over decades, those modest gains reshape durability in ways that remain invisible during the initial sale. Which leads to the real question: Why does complexity magnify every decision? The complexity multiplier. Why are RVs harder to build than passenger vehicles? A car is a controlled environment. Its systems are tightly integrated within a single shell. An RV, by contrast, combines living space and transport into one structure. It carries plumbing, electrical networks, structural framing, insulation, and interior components that must withstand weather, vibration, and long stretches of use. Every mile introduces movement. Every season introduces expansion and contraction. Water systems add risk. Interior fixtures endure constant shifting. The complexity multiplies because each subsystem interacts with the others. A small miscalculation in one area can cascade through the whole structure over time. When manufacturing discipline meets that level of complexity, the margin for error shrinks further. Precision in measurement and consistency in process become more critical. Variability that might go unnoticed in a simpler product can grow into visible wear in a mobile living space. Complex systems expose small miscalculations quickly. Expansion, contraction, and vibration amplify weaknesses that might remain hidden in simpler products. In a mobile structure combining living space and transport, interaction between subsystems determines whether stability endures or slowly erodes. In an environment where stresses compound, small weaknesses rarely stay small. They echo outward, magnified by motion and years. Understanding that multiplier sets the stage for looking at what disciplined production truly changes over the long run. Structural anchoring. Open an older Japanese RV and pay attention to how the interior is fixed to the structure. Cabinet frames are rarely hung only on thin wall panels. Instead, they are tied directly into framing members. Fasteners bite deeper. Screws are often driven into reinforced backers rather than hollow laminate. The result feels planted, not perched. Unsupported spans are minimized. Where a shelf might stretch across open space in other builds, you often find hidden reinforcement plates or additional bracing. The hardware does not rely on surface glue alone. Mechanical fastening carries the load. Over time, that difference matters. Vibration has fewer weak joints to exploit. You also notice fewer oversized cutouts in structural members. Openings are kept purposeful and tight. That restraint preserves rigidity. When the vehicle flexes on uneven ground, the load spreads through multiple contact points rather than concentrating in one corner. Long-term rigidity depends on load distribution. When forces are shared across multiple anchor points, stress diminishes at each connection. Over years of motion, that distribution reduces gradual loosening and preserves alignment that would otherwise shift under repetitive strain. These anchoring decisions remain invisible to most owners, yet they dictate how interiors age. Seal strategy. Why do some roofs hold up longer? Look at how penetrations are treated. Roof openings for vents and fixtures are often conservative in size. The cutout matches the component closely, leaving less exposed edge to seal. Layered sealing compounds are applied deliberately, not sparingly. Instead of relying on a single bead, multiple barriers are created to slow intrusion. Joint placement is another detail. Seams are arranged to reduce direct exposure to pooling water. Overhangs are used strategically to guide runoff away from vulnerable edges. Even the choice of materials reflects caution. Flexible sealants accommodate movement without cracking as quickly under temperature swings. Tolerance control also plays a role. When panels meet cleanly, gaps remain narrow. Narrow gaps require less filler and place less stress on the sealant. Over years of heat, cold, and vibration, that precision delays the moment when maintenance becomes urgent. Moisture intrusion rarely announces itself immediately. It advances slowly, exploiting marginal gaps and aging sealants. Designs that reduce exposure points and limit seam length simply present fewer opportunities for water to accumulate and migrate beneath protective layers. Roof durability is not glamorous, it is preventative. While structure and sealing guard against moisture, another system often reveals the next layer of discipline. Electrical design tends to expose how thoughtfully a RV was assembled. Wiring discipline. Why do electrical faults appear less chaotic? Remove a service panel in a carefully built Japanese RV, and the wiring layout often feels intentional. Harnesses are bundled neatly and secured at consistent intervals. Cables follow predictable paths instead of wandering across open cavities. That organization limits abrasion and reduces the chance of hidden wear points. Service loops are left where components may need replacement. Extra slack allows parts to be removed without straining connectors. Connectors themselves are labeled or color-coded in a consistent manner. When troubleshooting becomes necessary, the logic of the layout reduces guesswork. Access panels are positioned to expose key junctions without dismantling half the interior. Diagnostic pathways remain clearer because circuits are grouped by function rather than convenience. This approach does not eliminate problems entirely, yet it makes them easier to isolate and correct before they spread. Electrical stability depends on predictability. When circuits are organized logically, anomalies become easier to isolate. Reduced friction during troubleshooting prevents secondary damage that often occurs when technicians disturb unrelated systems while searching for a fault. Order in wiring reflects respect for long-term service, not just first assembly. Still, even the cleanest systems must endure forces that test them continuously. Mechanical stress ultimately tells the truth about design decisions. Weight control. Why does balance matter more than size? Weight management begins with understanding axle ratings and distributing mass accordingly. Instead of pushing limits, careful builders align body weight with the underlying platform's capacity. Components are placed to keep the center of gravity stable. Tanks, batteries, and heavy appliances are positioned to reduce sway and uneven loading. Platform matching is equally important. Pairing a living module with a chassis designed for sustained duty reduces strain over time. When suspension geometry works within its intended range, bushings, joints, and mounts experience less fatigue. That restraint slows the accumulation of small stresses. Balance also influences braking and tire wear. Even distribution reduces uneven forces that can ripple through the structure. Over years of travel, those incremental savings in stress translate into quieter interiors and fewer secondary failures. Balanced weight distribution reduces cumulative suspension fatigue. Even marginal imbalances accelerate uneven wear across tires and joints. Overextended travel, maintaining proportional loading helps preserve structural harmony throughout the chassis and living module alike. None of these choices announce themselves loudly at purchase. They reveal their value gradually. 5 years later, the difference between disciplined balance and excess weight becomes visible in how the RV holds together. Platform provenance. Look beneath the living space and focus on the foundation. Many Japanese RVs rely on commercial van platforms that were designed for delivery fleets and municipal duty. These platforms endure long production cycles, sometimes spanning more than a decade without radical redesign. Stability in engineering translates into predictable performance over time. A long cycle means refinements accumulate gradually instead of being reset with every model year. Weak points are identified in real-world use and corrected in subsequent updates. Suppliers mature alongside the platform. Parts catalogs expand. Technicians grow familiar with recurring systems. That familiarity reduces uncertainty when maintenance arises. The parts ecosystem also deepens. Filters, belts, sensors, and suspension components remain available long after initial sale. Availability reduces downtime and prevents improvised repairs. A drivetrain built on a commercial foundation benefits from scale and scrutiny. A drivetrain proven in commercial service benefits from constant real-world validation. Fleet usage reveals vulnerabilities quickly, allowing revisions before widespread adoption. That exposure refines components under demanding conditions long before they support a recreational living space. Mechanical longevity, however, tells only part of the story. Once the engine and transmission prove reliable, attention shifts inward. Interior wear begins to separate the careful from the rushed. If you value clear explanations over hype and want deeper insight before your next RV decision, subscribe and stay with the channel. Aging under vibration. Why do some interiors loosen faster? Time does not damage an RV in a single dramatic moment. It works through repetition. Every mile introduces vibration. Every turn flexes joints. Over years, stress accumulates in small increments. Materials respond differently depending on how they were selected and assembled. Fatigue appears first in subtle ways. A drawer may require a firmer push. A panel might creak when weight shifts. Hardware retention becomes visible when screws back out or brackets deform slightly. None of these signs arrive overnight. They are the result of compounded micro-movements. Owners notice patterns. Units that were assembled with restraint often age more predictably. Components wear, but they do so evenly. By contrast, rushed construction can reveal itself through uneven settling and irregular noises. The experience affects confidence. When a space feels unsettled, perception of quality declines. Vibration compounds invisibly. Each oscillation transfers energy into joints and fasteners. Over thousands of miles, cumulative micro-movements test retention strength. Interiors assembled with foresight respond gradually rather than abruptly when confronted with sustained dynamic stress. That perception influences behavior. If maintenance feels constant and unpredictable, frustration rises. Over time, the ease or difficulty of upkeep reshapes ownership cost in ways many overlook at purchase. Service reality. Why does access design matter years later? When an RV enters its 10th or 15th year, maintenance becomes routine rather than exceptional. Filters need replacement. Pumps may require inspection. Electrical connections demand tightening. The layout of service points determines how intrusive these tasks become. Repair time directly affects ownership experience. Accessible components reduce labor hours and lower service bills. Clear diagnostic pathways shorten troubleshooting sessions. Standardized components simplify sourcing. When parts align with common specifications, replacements remain affordable and available. Parts availability carries weight as well. A mature supply chain means fewer delays waiting for obscure pieces. Technicians develop familiarity with recurring configurations, reducing trial and error. Each of these factors lowers friction. Service accessibility shapes owner behavior. When maintenance feels manageable, minor issues are addressed promptly. Delayed intervention, by contrast, often transforms small repairs into extensive replacements. Ease of service quietly influences long-term structural preservation. Low friction encourages proactive care. Owners are more likely to address minor issues before they escalate. Gradual attention prevents larger failures and preserves overall condition. Over the years, that steady maintenance rhythm shapes something less tangible, but equally powerful. Reputation begins forming quietly in the secondary market. Market memory. Why do certain older units retain demand? Resale markets operate on collective memory. Buyers remember which models aged gracefully and which struggled. Consistency builds trust. Trust reduces hesitation. When a particular RV line earns a reputation for predictable upkeep, demand persists, even after production ends. That demand does not rely on nostalgia alone. It rests on observable outcomes. Prospective owners compare service records, visible wear, and anecdotal experiences. Patterns emerge. Units known for steady performance attract interest quickly, sometimes commanding firm prices despite age. Trust also influences negotiation dynamics. Sellers of well-regarded models often face less downward pressure. Buyers feel reassured by documented histories and widespread familiarity. Market memory becomes self-reinforcing. Strong past performance supports present value, which in turn sustains future perception. Markets reward predictability. Buyers gravitate toward models with documented longevity and stable ownership costs. Over time, that collective confidence strengthens resale consistency, reinforcing perceptions built from repeated positive outcomes. Still, sustained trust raises a difficult question. If this approach yields stability over time, why do all manufacturers not follow it? The answer lies beyond individual ownership and into broader industry incentives. Tools versus commitment. If lean manufacturing is global, why aren't outcomes identical? The methods are widely documented. Process mapping, waste reduction, standardized work instructions, and quality checkpoints are taught in universities and consulting firms worldwide. Companies from multiple continents have adopted similar vocabulary and frameworks. On paper, the tools appear transferable, yet tools alone do not guarantee results. Execution varies according to leadership priorities and daily discipline. A system can be introduced formally and still be applied unevenly. If management treats procedures as slogans rather than obligations, the impact fades quickly. Consistency requires sustained attention. It demands auditing processes even when sales remain strong. It requires slowing production temporarily to correct minor deviations before they grow. That level of commitment often conflicts with short-term targets. Adopting terminology is easier than sustaining discipline. When oversight weakens, procedures drift from intent. Over time, minor deviations normalize, and outcomes diverge from the original framework, despite surface similarities in operational language. Here, the conversation shifts toward incentives. The way organizations reward behavior ultimately determines how faithfully those tools are used. Production pressure. What happens when volume becomes the priority? Production pressure alters decision-making subtly at first. Delivery timelines tighten. Customization requests increase. Marketing campaigns promise features before factories have fully stabilized processes. Each of these pressures pushes teams to accelerate output. Margin considerations compound the effect. When cost targets grow aggressive, procurement teams search for savings in materials and labor hours. Small compromises may appear harmless in isolation. However, repeated concessions can accumulate into broader variability across units. Customization pace also influences stability. Rapid changes to layouts or features introduce new combinations of parts that may not receive long-term testing. Short validation windows increase the risk of unforeseen interactions once products reach the road. Escalating demand reshapes priorities subtly. When throughput targets dominate evaluation metrics, teams may defer corrective pauses. Accumulated acceleration can erode safeguards that once ensured uniformity across production cycles. Under sustained volume pressure, consistency competes with speed. The question then becomes not whether quality matters, but how long leadership is willing to prioritize it when demand surges. Ultimately, the chosen time horizon shapes how a product ages beyond its first sale. Short cycle versus long cycle. How does quarterly thinking influence durability? Organizations focused on short financial cycles often emphasize visible upgrades. New trim packages, refreshed interiors, and headline features create immediate marketing momentum. Feature churn keeps attention high, but can disrupt stability within production lines. Longer development cycles, by contrast, allow incremental refinement. When platforms remain stable for extended periods, engineers can study performance data and introduce targeted adjustments. Testing depth expands because changes are fewer and more deliberate. Launch speed also differs. Rapid rollouts compress validation phases. Extended cycles provide time for environmental testing and durability trials under varied conditions. The difference is not philosophical alone. It affects how consistently units perform years later. Market competition pressures every manufacturer, yet strategic patience influences outcomes. Some firms choose to absorb slower initial growth in exchange for steady reputation. Others chase quick gains and accept higher variability. Short planning horizons compress feedback loops. Without extended observation periods, latent weaknesses remain undetected. Durability benefits from patience, allowing real-world data to inform measured adjustments before widespread release. Regardless of approach, the marketplace eventually responds. Reputation builds or erodes based on lived experience, not advertising language. The real difference: it is tempting to attribute long-term stability to national identity or cultural mystique. However, the evidence suggests a more practical explanation. Durable outcomes emerge where structured discipline is maintained over time. Geography may influence context, but choices drive results. Decision-making at executive levels sets the tone. When leaders align incentives with long-term performance rather than immediate expansion, processes gain stability. When feedback from service departments informs production adjustments, lessons accumulate rather than disappear. This pattern does not imply superiority. It highlights alignment. Systems that reward patience, accountability, and incremental correction tend to produce consistent R-vees. Systems that prioritize rapid turnover and constant novelty accept greater variability as a trade-off. The difference, therefore, is not mystical. It is operational. Sustained discipline shapes outcomes that become visible years later in resale markets and owner confidence. Sustained outcomes arise where incentives reinforce restraint rather than speed. When organizations align evaluation metrics with longevity, process discipline strengthens. Over time, repeated adherence transforms structural consistency from aspiration into measurable reality. So, in the end, the real difference was never just the badge on the front. It was the discipline behind the build, the decisions repeated long before the first mile, and the standards that still show up years later. If you have seen that difference for yourself, share your experience in the comments. If this breakdown helped you look at R-vees in a smarter way, hit like, subscribe, and stay with the channel. There is always more going on beneath the surface than most buyers are ever told.